Here is a number, 1 in 100. Between 1,943 and 1,946, the United States held 375,000 German prisoners of war on American soil. They filled more than 400 camps across 46 states. They worked American farms, ate American food, drank American Coca-Cola, and were paid 80 cents a day by the same government whose soldiers they had been trying to kill 6 months earlier. The fences were low. The guards were few. 1 guard for a truckload of men, sometimes no guard at all. The nearest border was 1,000 miles of nothing. Every man in those camps was a trained soldier. Fewer than 1 in 100 ever tried to leave. Not because they couldn't, because something inside the wire was doing what no Allied bombing raid, no propaganda leaflet, no battlefield defeat had managed to do. It was taking apart, meal by meal, paycheck by paycheck, everything the Third Reich had built inside their heads. This is the story of 7 ordinary things that did the work of 1,000 bombs. It begins in May 1943, in the Tunisian desert, with 250,000 men who have just lost a war and are about to walk into a country that make them lose something far more dangerous, their certainty. But to understand what these men lost, you first need to know what they carried in. In August 1942, 9 months before the first mass surrender in North Africa, Joseph Goebbels published an essay about America in Das Reich, the most widely read weekly newspaper in the Third Reich. The essay was not unusual. Goebbels wrote about America the way a surgeon writes about a tumor, clinical language aimed at removal. Americans, he wrote, suffered from a naivete so complete it functioned as arrogance. The less they knew about a subject, the more confidently they spoke about it. That was the polite version. The longer version, the one repeated on radio broadcasts and printed in soldier pamphlets, painted a very specific picture. America was a mongrel nation. No real culture, no shared blood, a society held together by nothing but money, and pulling apart at the seams over race. Its army was soft. Its people were divided. Its factories made consumer goods, not serious weapons. And its soldiers, when they came, would fold at the first sign of real combat. This was the only map of America that most German soldiers ever carried, drawn by Goebbels, distributed by the state, reinforced in every barracks and mess hall from Berlin to Benghazi. Not a single man stepping off those trains in Virginia or Mississippi or Kansas in 1943 had ever been offered a second opinion. That matters, because what happened next makes no sense unless you understand how completely these men believed in a country that did not exist. They were not stupid. They were informed by a state that had perfected the art of informing people of things that were not true. Now set that map aside. Tunisia, May 1943. The Desert War is ending. Not slowly, not in stages, but all at once, like a building falling. Field Marshal Rommel left North Africa in March, recalled to Germany, and the army he left behind is collapsing. British and American forces have closed the trap. The ports are gone, the supply lines are gone. The Luftwaffe is gone. On May 13th, the Afrika Korps surrenders. Roughly 275,000 Axis soldiers pass into Allied hands in a single stroke. It is one of the largest capitulations of the entire war. Entire divisions lay down their weapons in the same afternoon. Officers who commanded thousands stand in line to be processed by corporals. One surviving prisoner's diary opens on that exact date, May 13th, the day the fighting ended for him, and the day, as he wrote it, something much stranger began. The men are marched into temporary holding areas in the desert. Wire cages near Oran and Casablanca. Open ground under the same sun they fought beneath. No shade. Minimal water. The kind of captivity that confirms everything they have. Americans are brutal. Americans don't care. This is what defeat looks like, but this phase does not last. Because the Americans have a problem, and it is not cruelty. It is arithmetic. What do you do with 250,000 prisoners when every square mile of Europe is a battlefield? You cannot keep them in North Africa. The theater is still active. You cannot ship them to Britain. Britain is a staging ground for the invasion of France, already packed beyond capacity. You need space. You need distance. You need a place so far from the fighting that escape becomes a geographical impossibility. The answer is floating offshore. Liberty ships, cargo vessels built in American shipyards at a rate that would have seemed fantastical to any German planner. They cross the Atlantic loaded with tanks, ammunition, food, fuel, everything an army on foreign soil requires. They deliver their cargo in North Africa and turn around. Empty holds going west. Not empty anymore. The prisoners fill them. Follow the logic, and it announces itself before anyone sets foot on land. A country that can afford to send ships loaded across an ocean and then send them home carrying nothing of military value. Nothing but the enemy. That fact alone, the sheer waste of it, was the first crack in the wall. Though most of the men below decks would not recognize it yet, they had other things on their minds. The crossing takes 10 to 14 days. Below decks, the men have only rumor and propaganda to navigate by. Many have never seen the ocean. Some have never left their home provinces before the war called them. And hovering over all of it, an irony that no one discusses openly, German U-boats are still hunting in the Atlantic. Their own navy could torpedo this ship and never know that the men drowning in the hold were wearing German uniforms. Whatever country they are picturing as the ship moves west, it is not the one waiting at the pier. In the spring of 1943, more than 150,000 prisoners arrive on American soil. After that, an average of 20,000 a month. The ships dock at Camp Shanks, New York, Norfolk, Virginia, Boston. On August 4th, 1943, a transport docks at Norfolk. The men aboard are routed to Camp Clinton, Mississippi. Names on a manifest moving into the interior of a country they know only from a Goebbels essay. Even generals make the trip. In June 1943, captured German generals are held at Angel Island in San Francisco Bay, where Fox Movietone cameras film them in the barracks and the mess hall. The footage is sent to newsreels across the country. The next day, the Los Angeles Times runs a headline that American readers find odd and German propagandists could never print. Nazi prisoners like war camp in United States. That headline will turn out to be more accurate than anyone intended. But the real education does not begin in the camps. It begins on the trains. The prisoners board expecting boxcars. Every army in Europe moves prisoners in boxcars. Wooden slats. Standing room, no windows. That is what transport means when you are a prisoner and the war is still burning. They get Pullmans, upholstered seats, windows. The train moves west. Some go south to Mississippi, Alabama, Texas. Others push into the plains, Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming. The routes fan out across a country that is still, in 1943, largely untouched by the war that has flattened half of Europe. And this is where the first crack becomes a fracture. Hour after hour, the farmland rolls past, green, gold, brown, depending on the season, flat to the horizon. Then no craters, no rubble, no bombed-out towns, no burned churches, no refugees on the roads, nothing that looks like war, nothing that looks like any country these men have ever crossed. By the second day, a rumor begins to move through the cars. The distances are impossible. No country is this large. No country is this untouched. The Americans must be driving the trains in circles. That is the theory, and for a certain number of men on those trains, it holds. An elaborate deception. Thousands of miles of staged scenery, looped and repeated, to make a small country look like a continent. It is easier for grown soldiers, veterans of Rommel's desert campaign, to accept a conspiracy of this scale than to accept the alternative. That the map inside their heads, the one drawn in ink by Goebbels and stamped with the authority of the Reich, is wrong. The trains keep moving. The farmland does not repeat. And somewhere between Virginia and Mississippi, between Norfolk and Kansas, the first of 7 strange things about America begins to register, not as an argument, but as a feeling, the feeling that the ground has shifted, and the place you thought you were going does not exist. The trains deliver them to an archipelago, 130 base camps, 295 branch camps, spread across nearly every state in the Union, 19 camps in Wyoming alone. Sites are chosen for space and distance, fairgrounds, fresh-built compounds on the edges of towns where labor is short and land is cheap. Camp Aliceville, Alabama, Camp Hearn, Texas, Camp Concordia, Kansas. The barracks go up fast. Mess halls, canteens, guard towers. Though the guard towers, it will turn out, are largely ceremonial. The War Department has done the math. Where, exactly, would an escaped German prisoner go? In uniform, speaking German, in the middle of Nebraska in 1943. The nearest neutral border is a continent away. The nearest coastline is days of walking through territory where everyone speaks English and no one is expecting a German soldier on the road. The ocean itself is the fence. The guard towers are decoration. Now consider who is stepping off these trains. Veterans of Rommel's Desert Army, men who fought at El Alamein, at Kasserine Pass, at Medellin. Many of them grew up in the hungry years after the last war, the 1920s, in cold water flats where the heat came from a coal stove, and the bread came dark and heavy and never quite enough. Then came the Reich, and the Reich told them what everything meant. It told them who they were, and it told them what America was. Weak, divided, decadent, soft. Some of that, they will find, is not entirely wrong. Most of it is about to fail on contact. Local newspapers photograph the arrivals. Farm towns turn out to what the columns march up from the depot. The enemy, an abstraction for 2 years, a face on a poster, a word in a radio broadcast, is suddenly local, walking down Main Street in tan uniforms, eating dust from a Mississippi road, and about to be handed a lunch tray. The guards are minimal from the start. The arrangement holds because everyone involved can see it holding, and because there is, practically speaking, nowhere to run. The stage is set. 250,000 men raised on Goebbels, delivered by empty cargo ships into the richest country on earth, deposited in small-town America among farm families and milk trucks and cotton fields. Everything that follows comes from that collision, and it begins in the mess hall. The first meal. Metal tray. On the tray, white bread, soft and sliced. Meat. Real meat. Not the canned substitutes they knew from the front. Fruit. Coffee, actual coffee, not the ersatz grain mixture that had replaced it in Germany years earlier. Portions large enough to feed a squad in the Desert Campaign. Some of the men eat immediately. They are hungry. They have been hungry for months, some of them for years, and the smell of real food overrides whatever caution remains. But others hold back. Food this rich, given this freely, to prisoners, in wartime, looks exactly like a trap. It has to be drugged, or poisoned, or the prelude to something worse, an interrogation technique, a softening before the real treatment begins. So they sit. They watch the men who ate first. They wait. Nothing happens. The men who ate first go back for seconds. Nothing happens to them either. Slowly, one tray at a time, the holdouts begin to eat. It was not a trick. It was a regulation. The 1929 Geneva Convention required a detaining nation to feed prisoners to the same standard as its own garrison troops. Most signatories bent that rule the moment the fighting started. The United States, for reasons of law, reciprocity, and a surplus large enough to make compliance painless, kept it. 3 meals a day, every day. For the duration of the war, white bread carried a particular charge. In the Reich, bread was dark, rationed, stretched with fillers. Here it came in soft white loaves, effectively without limit. Decades later, in oral histories recorded long after camps were dismantled and the men had grown old, it was the detail that kept returning. Not the barbed wire, not the guards, the bread. Hans Wecker, held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, would remember the treatment and the food as first-rate. Many of these men had grown up with nothing. Now they were gaining weight at the enemy's table. That was the beginning. A tray of food that a trained soldier mistook for a weapon. And the quiet, daily realization that followed, spreading through mess hall after mess hall, camp after camp, from Mississippi to Wyoming. The country they had been promised did not exist. The country they were standing in was something else entirely. And over the next 3 years, 6 more ordinary things would prove it. Within weeks of arrival, the mess hall had done its work on most of the men. Not all. Some held out, insisted the food was a tactic, a calculated softening before the real interrogation began. But hunger is a poor foundation for ideology. And 3 meals a day, every day, has a way of settling arguments that pamphlets cannot. What followed was slower, quieter. Not a single revelation, but a series of small ones. Ordinary things encountered in ordinary sequence, each one removing another brick from a wall that Goebbels had spent a decade building. The second strange thing arrived cold. Ice cream in the canteen. Coca-Cola at 5 cents a bottle, chilled, sweating in the summer heat, lined up in coolers as if the war were happening on a different planet. Chocolate bars for about a dime. Cold soda, cold beer, cold milk, in the middle of a world war that had stripped the shelves bare from Stalingrad to Berlin. Consider what this looked like to a man who had spent the last 2 years in North Africa, where water was rationed and sugar was a memory. Consider what it looked like to a man whose mother, back in Hamburg or Dresden or Cologne, had not tasted real chocolate in 3 years. Here, in a prison camp in Mississippi, a prisoner of war could walk into a canteen with his daily wage and buy a cold Coca-Cola, a chocolate bar, and a pack of chewing gum, and still have change. The canteen became the camp's central institution. Not the barracks, not the guard tower, not the mess hall, the canteen. Because the canteen was where the abundance became personal. The mess hall fed you because regulations required it. The canteen let you choose. Cold drink or chocolate, cigarettes or soap, small decisions of the kind a free man makes without thinking, handed back to men who had lost every other freedom, and every transaction carried the same quiet message. This country has so much that it can waste sweetness on its enemies. In Germany, sugar had been rationed since 1939. Here, American civilians outside the wire were living under their own sugar rationing, and yet somehow, inside the wire, there was enough for ice cream, the prisoners noticed. Some of them did the arithmetic. The country that was rationing sugar to its own people was still producing enough surplus to stock a canteen in a prison camp in Alabama. That equation, once computed, did not uncompute. The third strange thing was smaller than the others, small enough to fit in a pocket. But it carried more weight than its size suggested. Chewing gum, to a certain kind of German soldier, the educated kind, the ideological kind. Chewing gum was everything wrong with America, compressed into a single object. Vulgar, pointless, the habit of a culture with nothing serious to say. The camp newspaper at Aliceville, Der Zaungast, put that contempt in print in October 1944. Reviewing an American film, the paper sneered. "We know these boys who run around with long hair chewing gum. They are not our friends." That was the official, the position of men who still believed, or needed to believe, that the Reich's description of America was accurate. Gum-chewing boys. A soft culture. Nothing to fear, nothing to respect. Here is what actually happened in the fields. German prisoners on work details met American farm children across fence rows and cotton patches and sugar beet fields. The children were curious. The prisoners were, many of them, fathers, or young enough to remember being sons. And the thing they handed over, again and again, in camps across the Midwest and the South was gum, chewing gum, candy. Small gifts passed through barbed wire, or across a shared row of cotton. Mel Luchins was a boy in Murdoch, Nebraska, when the prisoners worked his family's land. He was 8, maybe 10, young enough to see uniforms without seeing enemies. Decades later, as an old man, he remembered it plainly. They played games with us and brought us candy and gum. They were people like us. People like us? From a Nebraska farm boy about men wearing the uniform of the Reich. The distance between that sentence and the sneer in Der Zaungast is the distance this entire story travels. Some of the men, handing over gum at the fence row, had read the editorial in their own mess hall. They knew what they were supposed to think about gum, about America, about boys with long hair. They handed the gum over anyway, and something shifted. Not in all of them, not all at once, but in enough of them, and steadily enough, that by the time the war ended, the editorial page and the fence row had switched places. The contempt faded, the gum remained. Those were the first 3. Food, cold drinks, chewing gum, material things, things you could hold, taste, count, evident through the stomach and the canteen window. The 4th was different. The 4th was not a thing. It was an absence. The absence of a lock. Every morning across hundreds of camps, prisoners climbed into trucks and rode out to work. Cotton in Mississippi, pulpwood in Alabama, sugar beets on the Great Plains. Farm labor, hard labor, the kind of work that American farmhands would have done if American farmhands had not gone to war. The trucks were open. The guards were few. 1 armed man for a truckload of prisoners, sometimes fewer. Sometimes a farmer drove out alone, picked up his assigned workers, and brought them back at sunset. No escort, no handcuffs, no roll call at the gate, just a head count and a wave. The men who rode those trucks had 6 months earlier been trying to kill Americans. They had fired rifles and aimed artillery and dug trenches against the same army that was now handing them a hoe and pointing at a cotton field. They were trained soldiers, physically fit, familiar with terrain and evasion. If any group of prisoners in the history of warfare had the skills to escape, it was this one. Almost nobody ran. The numbers tell it cleanly. Across 3 years and hundreds of thousands of men, total escape attempts numbered somewhere between 2,200 and 2,800, depending on who counted. Most who tried were recaptured within days, some within hours. Many by simply walking up to a farmhouse and asking for food because there was nowhere else to go. The security was minimal because it could afford to be. The War Department understood something about geography that the prisoners were just beginning to learn. In Europe, an escaped prisoner had options: neutral borders, sympathetic populations, underground networks, distances measured in dozens of miles. In America, an escaped prisoner had Nebraska. 1,000 miles of open country in every direction, where everyone spoke English and no one was expecting a German accent. But geography alone does not explain it. Prisoners in other wars, in other places, have escaped against worse odds. What held these men was the daily calculation, the one every prisoner made, whether he admitted it or not. Escape meant leaving behind 3 meals a day, a canteen full of cold drinks, 80 cents a day in wages, a bunk with a mattress, safety from the war still killing their countrymen in Europe. Escape meant walking toward arrest, hunger, and the loss of every small comfort the wire provided. A milk deliveryman named Don Kerr, making his rounds to a camp in Kansas, once asked a prisoner why he seemed so content. The answer, as Kerr remembered it decades later, was a single line: he liked it here because no one was shooting at him. That was the arithmetic. Not freedom versus captivity, but safety versus everything outside the wire. And for most of these men, most of the time, city won. The trust ran both directions. Farmers who hired prisoner work crews reported, overwhelmingly, that the men were reliable, skilled, and grateful for the work. In Kansas, the Bus family hired 4 prisoner stonemasons to build a concrete garage. The 4 men worked with no level, just a nail and a string, measuring by eye and hand. Keith Bus showed the garage to reporters decades later, still standing, still level, built by prisoners of war who had no reason to build it well, except that they were craftsmen, and the work was the one thing left that still made sense. Farmers invited their workers to Sunday dinner. Children played in the yards while prisoners repaired fences. Guards shared cigarettes at the end of a shift. The arrangement held because everyone involved could see it holding, because the prisoners had no incentive to break it, and had no reason to fear men who arrived each morning asking only for the chance to work and eat. And underneath all of it, moving slow and quiet, the 5th strange thing. The one that confused them more than the food, more than the trust, more than the open trucks, the paycheck. 80 cents a day. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners who worked had to be paid. Most countries that signed that convention found ways around it. Scrip that bought nothing, wages withheld for damages, bureaucratic delays that meant the money arrived, if it arrived, long after the work was done. The Americans paid on time. 80 cents a day in canteen scrip, redeemable at the camp store. The mechanics were straightforward. A farmer or contractor who used prisoner labor paid the government the prevailing local wage, $1.50 a day or 45 cents an hour. The prisoner drew his 80 cents. The difference went to the United States Treasury. Officers were exempt from labor entirely. Non-commissioned officers could be required only to supervise. The rules were printed, posted, and for the most part, followed. A daily wage. From the enemy. For being the enemy. What did 80 cents buy? One prisoner in Arkansas, a man named Pels, kept the arithmetic. A pack of cigarettes for 13 cents. A bottle of Gold Crest beer 10. The scrip went a long way in a canteen where everything was priced for an army private's pocket. Reckoned another way, a day's wage covered about 16 bottles of Coca-Cola, or a stack of 10-cent chocolate bars. Or, if a man was disciplined and the war lasted long enough, a small fortune. At Camp Douglas, Wyoming, one prisoner reported going home with close to 1,000 marks saved out of prison wages. Money earned inside the wire, carried back into the ruins of the Reich. Multiply it out. Hundreds of thousands of men. 80 cents a day. 3 years, a small economy running inside the American economy, administered by the Provost Marshal General's office, documented down to the camp-by-camp labor report. Government paperwork tracking the payroll of an enemy army, working the cotton fields and sugar beet farms of a country they had been told was collapsing. Some men spent every cent in the canteen. Some men saved as if the war would never end. And a few, though no one counted them precisely, began to notice that the system itself was the strangest thing of all. Not the wage, but the fact that it was honored. Every day, without negotiation, without threat. The country that held them prisoner was keeping its word. 5 strange things. 5 bricks removed from the wall. The food, the cold drinks, the gum, the trust, the paycheck. All of the material, tangible, countable. Things a man could verify with his own hands and his own stomach. The 6th was different. The 6th was not something America gave the prisoners. It was something America showed them, without meaning to, and it cut in a direction no one expected. In the fields of the American South, German prisoners were assigned work that the locals had a name for. They called it Negro work, picking cotton, harvesting peanuts, logging pulpwood, the kind of labor that, in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia in 1944, was understood by everyone to sit at the bottom of the social order. The prisoners did not choose this work. They were assigned it because this was the work that needed doing, and because the men who would normally have done it, black and white alike, were fighting a war on the other side of the world. And so, on those work details, something remarkable and terrible happened at the same time. German prisoners of war, white men, enemies of the United States, picked cotton side by side with black Americans. Two groups of men, one imprisoned by a foreign government, the other shortchanged by their own, working the same rows, under the same sun, for wages that in some cases were not far apart. The historian Matthias Reis studied those work gangs years later. What he found was notable for what it lacked: conflict. The relationships between prisoners and black American workers were, by most accounts, surprisingly free of tension. Each group recognized something of its own condition in the other. Each was, in its own way, a captive. But the recognition cut both ways, because in the same South where German prisoners and black Americans worked the same fields, a different set of rules applied once the work was done. In town, German prisoners, enemy soldiers in marked uniforms, were permitted courtesies that black American soldiers in the uniform of their own country were denied. The prisoners could eat in restaurants, sit in the front of a bus, use the main entrance of a public building. Black Americans, some of them combat veterans, some of them decorated for valor, could not. The black community said so, loudly, at the time, in editorials and letters and speeches that made the contradiction impossible to ignore for anyone willing to listen. December 1944. Camp Robinson, Arkansas. Lena Horne arrives to perform. She is, in 1944, one of the most famous entertainers in America. A singer, an actress, a woman whose face has appeared on magazine covers and movie screens across the country. She is also black, and when she walks into the performance hall at Camp Robinson, she reads the room in a single glance. German prisoners of war are seated in the front rows. American soldiers, black American soldiers, the men who guard those prisoners, the men who serve the same flag, are seated in the back. Horne does not perform the show as planned. She steps down from the stage. She walks past the front rows, past the German prisoners in their POW uniforms, past the men who had been trying to kill Americans less than 2 years ago. She walks all the way to the back of the hall, and she sings the entire concert to the black soldiers in the rear, her back to the prisoners, her voice aimed at the men her country had placed behind them. She wrote about it later, "I don't think I have ever been more furious in my life." The prisoners watched. They did not understand the language of what had just happened, not entirely. But they understood the geometry. A famous woman had walked past them, turned her back, and given everything she had to the men in the last rows. Something about the order of things in this country was not what it appeared. At the same time, in a decision that carried its own quiet weight, the United States assigned its first black nurses to the care of German prisoners of war. Black women, in American uniforms, tending the wounds and illnesses of men who had fought for a regime built on the doctrine of racial supremacy. The prisoners were supposed to arrive in a country weakened by its divisions. The propaganda had promised this: racial conflict, class warfare, a society eating itself from within, and the divisions were real. Jim Crow was not an invention of German propaganda. The segregated army was not a fiction. The front rows and the back rows at Camp Robinson were not a metaphor. But here was the thing that did not fit, the thing that broke the formula. America was divided, genuinely divided. Divided in ways that the prisoners could see with their own eyes, and it was winning the war anyway. Both facts were true at the same time. Both demanded explanation, and neither one fit the map that Goebbels had drawn. A weak country does not ship its enemies across an ocean on cargo ships running empty. A collapsing society does not feed its prisoners 3 meals a day while its own civilians ration sugar. A nation tearing itself apart over race does not win a two-front war against the most powerful military machine in Europe. And yet here they were. Cotton fields in Mississippi. Coca-Cola in the canteen. A black woman singing to her own soldiers over the heads of the enemy. All of it true. All of it simultaneous. All of it impossible, according to the map. The prisoners had no framework for this. Goebbels had given them a story in which American weakness and American division led inevitably to American collapse. What they were seeing day after day was American weakness and American division existing alongside American power, so vast it could afford to be generous to its enemies. That was the sixth strange thing. Not that America was flawed, but that it was flawed and overwhelming at the same time. That it carried its contradictions the way a river carries rocks, without slowing down. And the seventh, the last, was not a thing at all. It was a scale. Hundreds of camps scattered across a nation too large to comprehend from a train window. The prisoners had seen pieces of it on the way in. The farmland that rolled past for 2 days. The cities that appeared and vanished. The factories, the rail yards, the highways, the acres that stretched past the horizon and then kept going. But it was not until they had been inside the system for months, working the fields, riding the trucks, that the full weight of it landed. Do the arithmetic a prisoner could do. An ocean crossed on ships that were running empty. 4 days by rail, east to west, and the landscape never repeating. 3 meals a day for hundreds of thousands of men, every day for 3 years. Cotton harvested by prisoners in Mississippi, while the same country fought in France and Italy and the Pacific and North Africa, simultaneously. Canteens stocked with chocolate and Coca-Cola that stretched from the Carolinas to the Arizona desert. An economy so large it could absorb a captive population the size of a city and barely register the weight. Back home, their cities were burning. The RF was over Hamburg. The Americans were over Schweinfurt. Berlin was rubble. Dresden would be ash. The factories that built the tanks they had driven in Tunisia were being systematically reduced to scrap metal. Everything they had been told about German industrial superiority, about the invincibility of the Reich's war machine, was being disproved nightly in fire. Here the acres past the horizon had never felt a bomb. The factories ran 3 shifts. The trains moved on schedule. The surplus was so large, they ate better than the enemy's soldiers. No lecture was required. No propaganda film, no re-education pamphlet, no carefully worded argument about democracy versus fascism. A prisoner could stand in a field in Kansas and look at the horizon and do the strategic arithmetic himself. The war was lost, not because of strategy, not because of leadership, not because the wrong man gave the wrong order on the wrong day, because of math. Because a country this large, this productive, this untouched by the war it was fighting, could not be defeated by a country the size of Montana that was already burning. The realization did not come as a speech. It came as a feeling, the same feeling that had started on the train, the feeling that the ground had shifted and the certainty was gone. 7 things: cold drinks, gum, trust, a paycheck, a color line, and a continent. Not weapons, not arguments, not victories on a battlefield. Ordinary things, the texture of daily life in a country that the prisoners had been told was dying. And each one quietly, relentlessly, doing the work that 1,000 propaganda leaflets could never have done. Taking apart, brick by brick, everything the Reich had built inside their heads. But not all at once, and not in every man. Because 375,000 men do not change same speed. Some never change them at all. From the beginning, the camps had a political geography as real as any battlefield. On one side, the committed. Men who still believed, SS veterans, party members, officers who had sworn personal oaths to the Führer and meant them. These men unwatched the bread and the Coca-Cola and the open trucks and saw not generosity but strategy, American softness, A trick, the enemy trying to buy what it could not win. On the other side, the doubters, growing in number, month by month, but quiet about it. Men who had eaten the food and ridden the trucks and counted the acres and drawn their own conclusions. Men who suspected, and then believed, and then knew that the war was lost and the Reich had lied to them, but who said nothing, because saying something inside the wire could cost you more than silence. Between the two groups, a war of enforcement. The committed organized. They held meetings. They enforced discipline the old way, the way the Wehrmacht had always enforced discipline. Through hierarchy and intimidation, and the understanding that disobedience would be punished. Work slowdowns were staged against American labor assignments, not because the work was hard, but because cooperation with the enemy was collaboration, and collaboration was treason. At Camp Concordia, Kansas, the political fight turned serious. Men who expressed doubt were watched. Men who fraternized openly with guards or farmers were marked. The pressure was constant, low-grade, and effective enough to keep many doubters silent long after they had stopped believing. The camp newspapers became the front line. At Camp Aliceville, Alabama, 6,000 prisoners had pooled their canteen money to buy a used printing press. On July 16th, 1944, the first issue of their newspaper appeared. Der Zaungast, the onlooker. It was, from its first page, the voice of the committed, the voice that insisted the Reich would prevail, that American abundance was a mask over American rot, that the men eating white bread and drinking cold Coca-Cola were being softened for slaughter. Der Zaungast was not propaganda imposed from above. It was propaganda generated from within, written by prisoners, printed by prisoners, read by prisoners. And that made it more dangerous than anything Goebbels had ever published, because it came from standing next to you in the mess hall, not from a ministry 1,000 miles away. But discipline can hold a position. It cannot argue with a continent. And by late 1944, the doubters had something the committed could not counter. Evidence, not speeches, not arguments, just the daily accumulation of things that did not fit, the food that kept coming, the trucks that kept running unlocked, the paychecks that kept arriving on time, the horizon that never ended, and the news, filtering in through letters and radio and the testimony of new arrivals, that the cities back home were burning and the armies back home were retreating, and the war back home was lost. The committed could enforce silence. They could not enforce belief. And then came the escape that proved the point. December 1944, Camp Papago Park, outside Phoenix, Arizona. 25 German prisoners, most of them U-boat crewmen, men trained in confined spaces and patient work, began digging a tunnel. They worked at night, over weeks, removing dirt in small quantities, shoring the passage with scavenged wood. The tunnel extended roughly 200 feet, under the fence, under the perimeter, and out into the Arizona desert. They broke through on a December night and scattered into the darkness. 25 men, trained sailors, experienced survivors, loose in the American Southwest. The manhunt that followed was thorough, but almost unnecessary, because the problem the escapees faced was the same problem that had kept every other prisoner inside the wire. There was nowhere to go, Arizona in December, desert in every direction. No sympathetic population, no underground network, no neutral border within 1,000 miles. The men spoke German in a country where German was the language of the enemy. They wore uniforms or ill-fitting civilian clothes scavenged from the camp. They had no maps, no contacts, no plan beyond the fence. One by one, all 25 were recaptured, some within hours, some within days. A few held out longer, wandering through terrain that offered no shelter, no food, and no direction. Some simply walked up to a road and waited to be found. The desert had made the argument the fences never needed to. The Papago Park escape became, in the end, not a story of daring but a demonstration. The wire had never been the thing keeping the prisoners in. The continent was the cage. The ocean was the lock, and the 25 men who crawled through 200 feet of tunnel to prove they could get out proved, instead, that getting out meant nothing at all. After Papago Park, the escape attempts did not stop entirely, but they slowed. And the reason they slowed was not increased security or harsher punishment. It was the simple, spreading recognition that escape was not a solution. It was a gesture, and most of the men in the camps had stopped being interested in gestures. Then the war ended, May 8th, 1945. The news came through the radios that most camps allowed, through the American newspapers that circulated freely, through the guards who told the prisoners before the official announcements arrived. Germany had surrendered, unconditionally. The Reich that had told these men what to believe, what to fight for, who to hate, and what America was, had ceased to exist. In the camps, the news landed differently depending on who received it. For the doubters, the growing majority, it was confirmation. They had known. Some had known since the train ride in, since the first glimpse of farmland that went on forever. Some had known since the canteen, since the paycheck, since the day they stood in a Kansas field and looked at the horizon and did the math. The surrender was not a surprise. It was the last line of an arithmetic they had been computing for 2 years. For the committed, the shrinking minority, it was something else. Denial for some, grief for others. A few insisted the reports were American propaganda, one last trick before the real news arrived. But the real news did not arrive. The radios did not retract. The guards did not change their story. And slowly, even the hardest holdouts began to understand that the country they had sworn to defend no longer existed. The uniforms still had meaning. The PW on their backs still had meaning. But the authority that had sent them to war, that had printed the pamphlets and broadcast the speeches and built the wall inside their heads, was gone. And in its absence, a different voice. On March 1st, 1945, 2 months before the surrender, the first issue of a new newspaper had already appeared. Der Ruf, The Call, printed at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, written by German prisoners for German prisoners, backed by an American re-education program that had been quietly assembling for months. Der Ruf was not Der Zaungast. Where Der Zaungast had sneered and insisted and enforced, Der Ruf asked questions. Where the Aliceville paper had mocked American culture, Der Ruf examined what the camps had actually shown. The food, the trust, the paychecks, the open trucks, the continent that could not be explained away, and asked what it meant. Among its contributors was a man named Alfred Anders. He was not an Afrika Korps veteran. He had not surrendered in Tunisia. Anders had deserted from the Wehrmacht in Italy in June 1944 and given himself up to American forces. He was held at Fort Kearny, where he joined Der Ruf's editorial staff and helped shape the newspaper into something the camps had not seen before. An honest reckoning, written by Germans, aimed at Germans, about what Germany had done and what it had become. Anders would later become one of post-war Germany's most important novelists. But before the novels, before the literary fame, there was the newspaper, and there was a phrase that came to define what the camps had been: Der Golden Käfig, the golden cage, white bread, wages, Coca-Cola, no one shooting, comfortable, well-fed, still a cage. The phrase captured what 3 years of captivity on American soil had actually felt like for the men who lived it. Not brutality, not liberation, something in between, a confinement so generous it became its own kind of argument. 21 months separated the two mastheads. Der Zaungast, July 1944, sneering at American softness. Der Ruf, April 1000. 946, saying farewell. The distance between them is the entire story. And when the end came for Derouf, it came with a photograph. April 1st, 1946. The final issue. The editors, the prisoners themselves, assembled a farewell photo supplement. They titled it Abschied von Amerika. Farewell to America, images chosen and captioned by men who had arrived as enemies and were leaving as something harder to name. Not friends exactly, not converts, but not the men who had boarded those ships in Oran and Casablanca 3 years earlier. A farewell to America, written by men who had entered the country believing it was dying, and who were leaving it knowing that it was the largest, strangest, most contradictory place they had ever seen. A country that fed its enemies and segregated its defenders. A country that paid prisoners and denied citizens. A country so vast that 25 trained sailors could tunnel out of a camp in Arizona and find nothing on the other side but more of it. They were not leaving because they wanted to. Many of them, if given the choice, would have stayed. But the choice was not theirs. President Truman ordered the prisoners sent to whichever Allied country needed their labor. For many, that meant France first, or Britain, and more years of work rebuilding what their army had wrecked before they ever saw Germany again. The golden cage emptied slowly through the spring and summer of 1946. The camps that had held them were dismantled, sold, absorbed into army bases and county fairgrounds. The barracks came down. The canteens closed. The guard towers, the ones that had never really been necessary, were taken apart for lumber. On July 26, 1946, the last shipments sailed. Roughly 1,500 German prisoners departed from New Jersey. The program was over, a little more than 36 months after the Afrika Korps had first come ashore. Louis Carlson, a historian who spent years tracking down the survivors, interviewed more than 150 former prisoners and their American guards. The conversations, recorded decades after the camps had vanished, returned again and again to the same ground. The American years. The food, the work, the trust, the strangeness of being treated well by the people you had been trained to kill. In interview after interview, the time in American captivity surfaced as the war's unlikely good chapter. Not because it was comfortable, though it was, but because it was the place where the lie finally broke. Then the letters started coming the other way. From the ruins of occupied Germany, from cities that were rubble fields, from apartments with no heat and no windows and no food, former prisoners wrote to their former guards. They wrote to the farm families who had hired them. They wrote to the towns that had held them. They asked for food. The men who had once suspected the white bread was a trick, who had sat in the mess hall and watched others eat first, who had waited for the poison that never came, were now writing across the Atlantic to ask for the same bread. Whatever propaganda had survived the camps, whatever scraps of Goebbels still clung to the walls of their minds, did not survive this. A man does not write to his enemy asking for bread, unless he has stopped believing the enemy is his enemy. And some came back. In the years after the war, former prisoners emigrated to the United States, legally, on purpose. They applied for visas, crossed the same Atlantic they had crossed as prisoners, and settled in the same towns that had held them. They took citizenship. They married. They opened businesses down the road from their old camps. Here and there, in small towns across the Midwest and the South, a German accent appeared behind a shop counter or in a doctor's office and stayed. Hans Wecker, the prisoner who had praised the food at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, became a physician in Georgetown, Maine. The man who had eaten at the enemy's table built a life in the enemy's country. The golden cage, for men like him, had been the argument that outlasted the war. The paper trail remains. Camp inspection reports in Record Group 389 at the National Archives. Signal Corps photographs of the harvests in Record Group 111. A used press worth of newspapers tracking issue by issue. One army's change of mind. The camps themselves are gone or nearly gone. What survives is scattered. A photograph here, a memoir there, a concrete garage in Kansas, built by 4 prisoners with a nail and a string, still standing, still level. Decades after the men who built it went home. Fewer than 1 in 100 ever tried to leave. Set that figure against any other fence, any other wire, any other captivity in the century, and it reads less like a security statistic and more like a verdict. These men were not held by locks. They were held by bread and paychecks and cold Coca-Cola, and a country so large it made escape a philosophical question rather than a practical one. In Murdoch, Nebraska, a boy who took gum from German prisoners across a fence row grew into an old man who still described them the same way. People like us. That sentence is the whole distance this story traveled. From Goebbels to a fence row in Nebraska. From the map that lied to the country that was real. In 9995, Smithsonian Magazine went looking for the program's survivors. By then, the men who had been young soldiers in Tunisia were old men in German towns and American suburbs. The camps were memories. The bread was a story they told their grandchildren. The war was history. One former prisoner delivered the closing verdict. The magazine made it the article's title. America beats by far anything, 7 ordinary things. A slice of bread, a cold drink, a stick of gum, an unlocked truck, a paycheck, a cotton field, and a horizon that never ended. Not weapons, not arguments, not the products of any deliberate campaign to change minds. Just a country, being itself, in front of men who had been told it was something else, and that in the end was enough.